Australia has entered a new military alliance with the United Kingdom and the United States, called Aukus. As part of this agreement, Australia is set to receive a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines, which will be built in cooperation with the US and UK at Adelaide in South Australia. Australia will also receive Tomahawk cruise missiles and joint air-to-surface standoff missiles from the US, although the submarines won't arrive for another decade or two. Australia, the UK, and US make up 3 of the so-called Five Eyes alliance. The United States already has an enormous military presence in Australia, with several military bases, the most famous being the spy station at Pine Gap. Around 2,500 US Marines are on permanent rotation in Australia. The Asia-Pacific Journal writes that the US military has access to all major Australian Defence Forces training areas, Northern Australian Royal Air Force airfields, and port facilities in Darwin and Fremantle. The Defence Minister, Peter Dutton, confirms that AUKUS will include greater air cooperation through rotational deployments of all types of US military aircraft to Australia. Australia's acquisition of these submarines has raised questions about non-proliferation and the transfer of nuclear technology and materials. How will China perceive a heightened military presence of foreign troops on its doorstep? What does it mean when the media and former intelligence officials are saying that America's focus on the Middle East has to shift towards China and the Indo-Pacific? And does Australia really have any sovereignty when its foreign policy is being guided by Washington, D.C. and Whitehall? To find out more, I thought I'd ask Dr. Allan Patience. He's an honorary principal fellow in the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Melbourne. He's taught political and Asian studies at universities in Australia and Japan, and has occupied visiting professorships in China, Taiwan, Burma, and Papua New Guinea. His work focuses on Australian foreign policy. Dr. Allan Patience, thanks so much for joining me today. It's great to have you on.
My pleasure.
Professor, you recently wrote that Australia is repeating certain foreign policy and defense mistakes from the last century. I was hoping if you could maybe elaborate on those mistakes for us.
Okay. Well, I was referring in that case to the 1919 peace conference in Paris after World War I. The Australian representative was our Prime Minister at the time, Mr. Billy Hughes, who was one of the leading architects of what was called the White Australia policy. He was an out-and-out racist and particularly disliked Asian people. The Japanese, of course, were represented at the peace conference in a quite significant delegation. They made some proposals that upset the Australian Prime Minister. The first proposal was that, all German territories in the Pacific should be encouraged and helped by Australia and Japan together towards independence, to end colonialism, German colonialism. And the second proposal that the Japanese made was that the new charter for the League of Nations that was being formed at much the same time should have an anti-racist clause in its charter. Now, Billy Hughes was absolutely horrified at these two suggestions. He opposed them bitterly. He was extremely rude in the conference proceedings. He used to put his foot up on the table and shout and just gesticulate, particularly at the Japanese, telling them off. And as a result, the Japanese, first of all, were humiliated at that conference. Eventually, they withdrew from the League of Nations. And certainly that was a contribution to the enmity that was created between Japan and Australia in World War II in the Pacific Theatre. And what I was trying to suggest is that Scott Morrison, our present Prime Minister, is doing exactly the same thing. He's now being very rude about China in a number of international forums and provoking China's hostility. So I think history is repeating itself.
Yeah, that's a wonderful analogy. And when it comes to Australia and what Australia has to gain from all this, these nuclear submarines, it's said they won't be arriving anytime soon. As a matter of fact, we've heard the year 2040 being floated around. So if Australia has to wait 2 decades for these submarines, what exactly are America and the UK gaining in the meantime from this partnership with Australia, especially in terms of being able to use Australian territory and soil?
First of all, I think it's important to note that there is no submarine at the moment. All there is a promise that nuclear power will be made available for whatever submarine is chosen in a time frame of the next 18 months. So it's still a fantasy. It's not a reality at all. What will the Americans achieve? Well, for a long time now, Australia's military capacity, defence capacity, has been, and I've got to use an awful official word here, interoperable with the United States military. That is to say, we are really just a very small part of the US military and defence arrangements in the Asia-Pacific region. This now consolidates that relationship as far as the Americans are concerned. There's been some talk emerging in Australia, particularly during the time of Trump's presidency, that maybe we can't rely on America any longer. And that's a feeling that's been growing. And the Americans want to counter this. And they've come in now with this proposal. And that's what, and at the same time, and by the way, the concerns about America's reliability, we'd had one former prime minister, for example, saying that it's time to rip up the alliance with the United States. And that would mean, amongst other things, kicking Pine Gap, which is a huge American spy base in the middle of Australia that's been spying on China and other East and Southeast Asian countries, getting rid of that, for example, and that would really remove a major part of the US's intelligence capacity, gathering capacity in this region. So America is in pushing us into this arrangement, if you like, is consolidating its grip on Australia's sovereignty very strongly. As far as the British are concerned, I think it's just empire nostalgia. They still think of Australia as a colony, and in many respects we still are a colonial mindset. And yes, it's for the British. They might get one of their submarines selected, but it's very unlikely. I'm sure it'll be an American submarine.
You mentioned Australian sovereignty. What does Aukus entail exactly for Australia's sovereignty? How does it get out of this colonial mindset?
I think it's important to note that in international politics, international relations, Australia styles itself as a middle power, a so-called middle power. I've argued elsewhere that there are different kinds of middle powers, but the kind of middle power that Australia is as a dependent middle power. Its claims to have a kind of middle power status are entirely reliant on its alliances with big powers, and in this case, the United States. So already, as a dependent middle power, Australia's sovereignty has been severely constrained. As the former Prime Minister that I was referring to earlier, Malcolm Fraser, he was a Conservative Prime Minister, by the way, who's saying, let's get rid of the American alliance. And he was saying, look, Australia has very little sovereignty. And Aukus, as they call this new strange arrangement, is yet further evidence that we are very lacking in sovereignty, that we will we'll always do as we're told. And that's evident, for example, in that Australia has been into every single war that the United States has had since the end of World War II, during World War II as well. We've been into every single war. Korea Peninsula War, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on. It's quite extraordinary. In many respects, we're a very warmongering country, but very keen to be with America in its wars. And as one final point I could make here, in all of those wars, not one single possibility, not one of the objectives of those activities was achieved. In all cases, there've been defeats.
If I may just add briefly, I'm covering Julian Assange's extradition hearing in England. I was there in court barely a year ago, a month and a half ago. You know, something that's been very noticeable to me is that Australia's Foreign Minister, Marise Payne, Scott Morrison, none of them have even tried or dared to comment on the fact that the US is slowly killing an Australian citizen. It's extraordinary. I always viewed it as being part of this paradigm that Australia is unfortunately pressured and just, does what the US tells it. I think it's another manifestation of this.
There are many instances like that, many instances. And the Julian Assange case is a particularly egregious example of how our Prime Minister and various ministers have refused to say anything in his defense. It's an appalling fact.
And Professor, if I may just ask another question, what does Aukus signify for China? How is this military partnership perceived by them? Do they also agree with the premise that it's going to boost security and stability in the Indo-Pacific, or do they view it more frankly as a threat? And I of course, I ask this question as a rhetorical one.
Sure, yes. Well, I think China will see it more a provocation than a threat. But the very significant thing is that by aligning ourselves now so utterly with the United States, Australia will become a hostage, possible hostage for Chinese attacks. If China needs to assert itself and demonstrate to the United States that it's serious about protecting its interests, for example, it could launch a ballistic missile with a nuclear warhead onto Pine Gap or onto the American Marine base in Darwin. And by bombing a very small ally of the United States, they're not actually bombing the States itself. So, yes, I think it's a very dangerous situation that we're putting ourselves in. I, like Malcolm Fraser, I'm deeply critical of the lack of sovereignty that we have, the lack of independence that we have, and our failure to understand the limitations of being a dependent middle power.
Last question, Professor. What do you think would successfully remedy the situation?
Well, I again agree with Malcolm Fraser. It's time for Australia to stand on its own feet, to stop being fearful of its Asian geopolitical location, learning how to live closely with our neighbours in an amicable and understanding way, and then for Australia to if you like, pursue a kind of non-aligned movement arrangement in alliance with a number of other states with similar interests. And I'm thinking particularly of the Scandinavian states, which are very good at this, but some of the Southeast Asian states too, that we ought to be much closer to.
Dr. Allan Patience, thank you so much for your time, Professor. Really a pleasure speaking with you and having you on.
It's been an honor to be with you. Thank you very much.